Hi, welcome to our presentation. We will be talking about aquaculture, specifically how it affects water quality, some of the emerging contaminants, and how those affect human health. So just as a brief overview, we want to explain what aquaculture really is, some of the current concerns and contaminants, which include hormones, antibiotics, and invasive species. And we want to give a brief conclusion of our findings and how they relate to each other. So what is aquaculture? As defined by NOAA, aquaculture is essentially the raising and farming of aquatic species, especially shellfish and fish made for consumption. This can include salmon, trout, carp, etc. And then, although aquaculture is mainly used for breeding fish for consumption, it's also used for producing commercial products like vitamins, and it's used as a way to restore endangered or threatened populations. In marine aquaculture, this takes place in oceans and estuaries, and in freshwater aquaculture, this takes place in ponds, lakes, and other man-made systems. Something else that's important to note is that aquaculture, or these fish farms, can either be in a closed system or an open system, and that means exactly what it sounds like. In a closed system, there is a barrier in between the farm, the pond, whatever it is, and the surrounding water body, while an open system means that there's no barrier, meaning that water can flow in and out of the pond. And this is how we get contaminants in our water.
So, aquaculture use on the rise. Uh, Over the past few centuries, the world population has grown to 8 billion people, and it is expected to steadily increase and plateau around 9 to 10 billion people. As aquaculture, as the human population grows, there is an increased demand in specifically middle to low income countries for aquaculture. And as uh, in today, uh, aquatic organisms account for 17% of all animal protein consumed, but as a population continues to grow, so will the demand, and our ecosystems simply can't keep up with our need to consume seafood. So this has put a strain on world fish populations, and fish farms have become commonplace in order to keep up with the growing markets. And if you look at the graph to the right, the top graph shows uh, aquaculture, aquacultural production from 2015 to the to projected to 2030. And between 2015 and 2030, it is expected to rise around 33%. And China makes up for over half of all aquaculture production. And the bottom graph shows antibiotic consumption, and I will talk about that further down the slides.
So I will be talking about hormones, which in recent years, they have become an emerging contaminant in the water environment. This was taken from one of the articles I researched that kind of gives a general broad overview of hormones as a contaminant and their effects on the environment. So studies have shown that over time, hormones used in aquaculture to boost growth and reproduction will bioaccumulate in organisms and will be released from farming facilities. So what does that mean? Essentially, the hormones used in fish farming or aquaculture are used to buff up the fish and make sure that they include more protein, that they are bigger, that they will produce in larger quantities to meet the consumer demand. However, this bioaccumulation of hormones and steroids does have a negative effect for the environment and on human health. So in that general article that I had just mentioned, the methods of detection used were immunoassays, gas chromatography, which is time consuming, but they claim it is accurate. And they also use liquid chromatography, which is the most effective and preferred method. And this method essentially separates the particles from each other so that researchers can look at different things such as proteins, DNA, and in this case, it would be steroids and hormone residuals. So the environmental concerns of hormone use, hormones can either be organic or they can be chemically synthesized. This is mostly used for steroids, but they will enter the aquatic system via sewage system outputs. And in turn, this affects the local water body. This will cause feminization and hermaphroditism in fish species, as well as it's going to change the reproductive system of certain organisms. So, looking at a specific case study, this was done in Bangladesh. And the reason that there are a lot of case studies in Bangladesh is because they heavily rely on farmed fish to meet their consumer demands, and they have the perfect environment for it. So, concerned with human health, a study was done to test fish in 3 different districts for elevated concentrations of hormones. So the study looked at tilapia, looked at carp and catlet fish, and they were tested at just local and regional farms and markets where the fish were sold across 3 different districts. And if you'd like to learn more, you can click the link down below. But they were testing the residual concentration of hormones. And what this means is it is just the concentration of leftover steroids and hormones above the level that already exists in the fish. And this was calculated using that same liquid chromatography method. So if we look at the graph to the right, we can see that with an increase of area, larger area over the districts, we see a larger concentration of certain hormones like testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen. The hormonal residuals were detected in 98% of the 3 types of fish samples, and among those that tested positive, 92% of the samples contained hormonal residuals above the acceptable dietary intake level, meaning that this is concerning for human health and is not safe for consumption. The study also found that consumers were not aware of the use of hormones in fish farming, let alone that the fish they were eating had hormone residuals over the acceptable dietary intake level. And this was found out in the study by not just testing the fish with the liquid chromatography, but they also did a qualitative assessment where they went around to the different fish farms, to the different markets, and they asked the sellers, the vendors, the farmers, if they were marketing their fish as having been used hormones as their hormones. And they found that 60 to 70% of the farmers did not market their fish as having additional hormones added. So because of this, it's important to note that there needs to be more regulations and laws to establish limit on hormone use. And more importantly, there needs to be better and more effective education opportunities as well as marketing for consumers so that people know exactly what they are ingesting. It's important to know what they are ingesting because it has a lot of human health impacts. Anything to do with an increase or even a decreased level of hormones. And this could lead to increased chances of breast cancer, increased chances of glaucoma. It may cause damage to the liver. It's especially risky for women, especially for postmenopausal women. There's increased chances of obesity, decreased fertility, and in general, it will cause reproductive risks. Another important thing to know is steroids are endocrine disruptors, and this leads to a range of problems for living organisms, not just humans, not just the ones listed to the left. However, this leads us to the current limitation of research done on hormones. And aquaculture is that most research and legislation is focused specifically on endocrine disruptors in pharmaceuticals, but not so much the hormones themselves, such as testosterone or estrogen.
Antibiotics. Just a bit of background. The nature of aquaculture involves having large populations of fish that are in a relatively small volumetric area. Because of the high density farming associated with aquaculture, disease outbreaks are common and have the potential to quickly arise and spread throughout the fish population, usually making the fish sick or just killing them. In order to combat this, farmers administer antibiotics to control the disease outbreaks, and in addition to that, They can also enhance growth rates, and it makes them able to sustain the large populations needed for cultivation and eventually, and also just like sustaining, what they grow, uh, their the revenue that they make from that. So antibiotics are usually administered by mixing the drugs with the feed for optimal delivery. Um, just putting the antibiotics in the water usually is not enough, so they usually just mix it in with their feed. So antibiotic contamination in Bangladeshi wastewater. This is another study in Bangladesh. It is separate, but one big reason why both of them are in Bangladesh is because Bangladesh is the fifth largest producer, uh, is the fifth largest contributor in aquaculture. And for the site selection, the researchers chose five sampling sites, kind of like regions, where um, there was high aquaculture activity and production. The study targeted 26 different antibiotics, each belonging to seven different classes of drugs. Uh, and they tested the surface waters of 50 aquaculture farms cultivating shellfish and finfish. Finfish just referring to um, finfish, such as tilapia, carp, trout, etc. So the samples were taken from culture ponds of various farmers from the sites. So sample analysis, the researchers used water grab samplers, and they went to each site and used composite surface water samples, which just means that they got water from three different places in the ponds in order to give an accurate overview of the composition. And they did this until each vial was filled to 500 milliliters, and um, the samplers themselves were amber colored to protect against UV light coming in and potentially and keeping preserving the integrity of the antibiotics. So after the samples were collected, they were immediately transported to the laboratory at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. The samples were then put through a filter in order to remove suspended particles. And in order to separate between the 26 different antibiotics, they use a high performance liquid uh, chromatography system, which was used to isolate and test the different concentrations of drugs. So the results, out of the 26 tested antibiotics, 15 were detected, and out of the 15, they actually found that 10 of those weren't previously detected in Bangladeshi uh, aqua farms and wastewater prior to the study. So out of all the different species of fish, Pangas fish uh, had usually had the highest concentrations of antibiotics, and the concentrations themselves ranged from below levels of detection to a maximum of 25,000 nanograms per volumetric liter. Uh, Although there isn't a certain set safety limit on antibiotics, since it varies from country to country and from antibiotic to antibiotic. Just for example, in the United States, there are certain antibiotics that uh, the limit might be only 15 nanograms per volumetric liter. So that just goes to show how high the number of 25,000 is in this case. So ranging from highest concentrations to lowest concentrations, amoxicillin was tested at the highest concentration, and amoxicillin is part of the penicillin drug group, which is used to treat a variety of human infections. And because of this, it shows the highest risk of forming bacterial resistant in bacteria populations nearby. I'll talk about that. This study also detected human and veterinary antibiotics such as lincomycin and um, uh, metronidazole. And this is significant because it shows how urban runoff and domestic runoff in general ends up in wastewater, not only in these culture ponds, but probably eventually downstream over to larger bodies of water, such as rivers and lakes, etc. So the human health impacts, the biggest the biggest concern of antibiotic pollution is potential for bacteria to develop an antibiotic resistance. And this is when bacteria or other pathogens such as fungi and viruses develop an adaptation that makes them resistant, in some cases, almost completely immune to certain drugs. This makes treating bacterial infections very difficult with antibiotics since they're no longer effective enough to treat the infection, and this leads to higher mortality rates in humans. And although uh, most antibiotics used in food uh, are used in terrestrial animals, it is much more, the risk of antibiotic resistant is much higher in aquatic and aquaforms because it is suspended in water. And once the antibiotics are released in the water, it is easy for it to spread a lot further distance into larger bodies of water where it is exposed to bacteria, which can develop antibiotic resistant. And they don't have to develop that resistance in a larger body of water. They can very well do that in the same culture ponds. So, according to the CDC, it was reported that about 2 million people get infected every year with antibiotic resistant pathogens, and 23,000 of them end up dying. And globally, antimicrobial, that's also lumped together. Other pathogens that developed that that developed similar resistant. So antimicrobial resistant is an urgent global public health threat, and it kills at least 1.27 million people worldwide and is associated with 5 million deaths alone in 2019. So ways to mediate antibiotic pollution. One way is vaccines. Vaccines have shown some promise when it comes to reducing bacterial infection. Uh, One particular study in Norway, an aqua farm previously had used 50,000 kilograms of antibiotics every year. Uh, following After this, they introduced a preventative vaccination strategy where they would vaccinate the fish with the bacteria that uh, usually causes these infections. And after they implemented that, they had dropped their annual use of antibiotics to only 1,000 to 2,000 kilograms a year. So far, vaccinations used in aquaculture have not been able to protect against all diseases, but more research and development is currently going into this to expand the use of vaccinations. And another way to reduce um, pollution in general uh, is by preventative measures, such as legislation limiting the use of certain antibiotics, improving the efficiency of the absorption of them in fish, and more hygienic living conditions, which reduces the number of disease outbreaks, which would minimize the amounts of antibiotics being used and therefore released into environments. And this lowers the chances of antibiotic resistant bacteria emerging.
Invasive species. Let's start by defining what an invasive species is. An invasive species is a non-native organism that gets introduced, usually by human activity, into an environment where it doesn't naturally belong. The key issue is that it has the ability to cause harm once it's there. The harm can affect entire ecosystems, human health, and water quality. When invasive species are introduced, they often outcompete native organisms for resources, throw off natural balances, and alter water chemistry in ways that are really hard to reverse. For example, they can disrupt nutrient cycles, promote harmful algal blooms, and reduce oxygen levels in the water, which make it harder for native species to survive. We'll break all of that down further, but the takeaway here is that once an invasive species gets a foothold, it's incredibly difficult to control or remove. Aquaculture, an invasive species. So how exactly does aquaculture tie into all of this? Aquaculture or fish farming is a major pathway for introducing invasive species into aquatic environments. It starts with the importation of exotic species. Farmers often choose non-native fish because they grow faster or are more profitable. But raising them domestically, especially in open water pens, carries a high risk of escape, either due to structural or failure or human error. Other issues are hitchhiker organisms, things like algae, parasites, or tiny invertebrates that attach to equipment, feed, or even the fish themselves. They can get released accidentally and start reproducing in the wild. Then there's non-native feed and pathogens that come along with it, or even deliberate introduction where new species are added to try to control pests but end up becoming invasive themselves. All of these entry points mean aquaculture has become a key vector for the spread of harmful species, often unintentionally. Consequences for ecosystem and human health. So, what happens when invasive species take hold? On the ecosystem side, we see habitat destruction, like when invasive plants choke out wetlands or when bottom-feeding invasive fish stir up sediment and reduce water clarity. There's also biodiversity loss, which weakens the entire food web. When native species are pushed out, the ecosystem becomes less resilient and more prone to collapse. Then there's the spread of parasites and diseases, which invasive species can either carry with them or make worse by stressing native populations. For human health, the consequences are just as serious. Invasive species can contaminate our water supply. Think about increased harmful algal blooms or the introduction of pathogens. There's also a risk to food security, especially seafood, if the quality or safety is compromised. Lastly, we're seeing a rise in vector-borne diseases. For instance, stagnant water created by invasive plants or sometimes fish can become breeding grounds for mosquitoes. Aquaculture, a gateway for exotic species. This leads us to the research side of things. One study took a deep dive into how aquaculture serves as a gateway for exotic species. The researcher wanted to know how current aquaculture practices contribute to the introduction of these species and what ecological consequences follow. The goal was to assess whether we have adequate policy mechanisms in place to prevent these introductions and whether they are blind spots in how the industry operates. It's a really important question because the industry is growing rapidly, but the oversight hasn't necessarily kept up with it. Methods and findings. To answer the questions, the study analyzed scientific literature and case studies from around the world. They looked at species like the green crabs, Japanese oyster drills, and invasive seaweeds, all of which have spread due to aquaculture-related activities. The findings were pretty clear. Aquaculture is a major vector for introducing exotic aquatic species. The study also found that many regions lack strong protective policies. There's often little regulatory oversight. And common patterns of poor contaminant strategies. Many areas don't even have proper assessment protocols in place. In short, the risks are high and the safety nets are low. Mitigation and future policy implementation. So what can we do to prevent these things from happening? The research pointed to a few major policies, areas where we need to focus on. First, we need solid risk assessment frameworks that evaluate potential species before they're even imported. There's economic analysis. We need to take the cost of ecological damage into account when deciding what species to raise or how to raise them. Sometimes saving money up front creates far more expensive problems later. We also need long-term ecological monitoring to track how species are spreading and how ecosystems are responding. This can help us act earlier when new threats emerge. And finally, investing in biological and physical technologies like filtration systems or sterilization techniques can help prevent species from escaping in the first place. All of this means that aquaculture can be made safer, but it requires proactive effort from governments, industries, and communities. To wrap it up, aquaculture can be a sustainable way to feed the planet, but not without safeguards, without proper regulation and foresight. It opens the door to invasive species that can disrupt water quality, damage ecosystems, and threaten public health. By understanding these connections, we can push smarter policies and more reasonable practices in how we farm our oceans and waterways. And for the main conclusion of this presentation, hormones, antibiotics, and invasive species found in aquaculture have a direct impact on food supply and aquatic health. For human health, the greatest concern is the biofragmentation of synthetic hormones, steroids, and antibiotic-resistant pathogens. Suggestions for future research, more frequent testing for hormone residuals and antibiotics, as well as stricter regulations for hitchhiker organisms. Future studies are needed to find cost-effective measures in removing antibiotics from wastewater. Thank you for listening, and these are our references, and that's all.